Hey everybody, welcome to the video. This video is going to be covering the Austrian mainline of the Czech Pirc. It's one of the most critical lines, and so pay extra careful attention. Critical because, pretty obvious reason, in our flexible setup we afford white the opportunity to completely grab space in the center, which means that we will have to be fighting back in extra creative and combative ways, and white is just threatening to try to refute our system altogether. Luckily, chess is not so simple that a little space advantage is enough to beat us, so I think that be excited for some of the most tactical and crazy lines of the Czech Pirc and some of the strangest moves that might catch your opponent off guard. So let me just back up a second here just to show how we arrived at this position after e4, e6, d4, knight f6, so we're striving for some sort of Pirc setup. Knight c3, and we arrive at our Czech Pirc. So f4. And if you've never seen this position before, the next move might already surprise you, but it's a very logical move that you can find if you just think about the fact that we want to be able to fight back against the central expansion here with a move like e5 or d5, but it's not so easy. However, we have this really cool move, queen a5, and this is the beginning of our shenanigans. Queen a5 is more than just a threat of taking this pawn on e4. That's probably one of the main reasons why queen a5 is better, and what makes this whole position so viable, better than a move like queen c7, which would also support this push for e5. And you'll even find that opponents might completely forget about this pawn hanging on e4, and we'll cover that in a second here, because we can in fact just grab that for free and play that position. So I'll just take a moment to pause here to talk about the different variations. The main line is going to be after bishop to d3, a very logical developing move that supports the e4 pawn, and this is going to be the subject of today's video. In a secondary video for covering the Austrian attack, we will be talking about the moves bishop to d2, which is also a logical way to defend the e4 pawn, and probably the trickiest of the lines, which is e5. Very principled pawn push, and this is very complicated. These lines are pretty long, so that's why I'm breaking it up into different videos. So for today, we'll just talk about the bishop to d3 line. So just briefly before that, let's have some fun. Our opponent just played an automatic autopilot move, and we just won a free pawn. So what happened here? Usually, I think probably in all your games, you'll see bishop to d3. It's the most reasonable move. If your opponent is afraid of you winning a second pawn by taking on c3 twice, they might play bishop to d2. But in actuality, we're not threatening to win another pawn. We'll see after bishop d3. If we were to take on c3 twice, that would really be getting greedy, because white has a significant lead in development, and we have to be a little careful about not handing them some sort of powerful initiative with our pawn grabbing. So yeah, if I move like bishop d2, we can just take that, play a move like bishop to g4, and e6, thank them for the extra pawn and the bishop pair. We might give the bishop back, but we'll get some sort of nice position where we play for, let's say, d5. Our bishop can come to some of these squares and play with a good bishop and pawn structure, an extra pawn. So most likely you'll see bishop d3. And here I'm going to offer two different ways of playing. The most solid way is d5, and after, let's say, castles, f5. So these positions are going to be pretty locked, which is why after I show it, it'll make pretty clear sense of how you're supposed to play it. But I can understand if maybe this isn't appealing to somebody, because the positions are very hard for both sides to prove an advantage, even though we have an extra pawn. Well, extra hard for white to prove an advantage, then, I should say. Black is definitely better. A move like, actually just backing up a second here, yeah, let's not forget that queen h5 is a problem after knight e5. So definitely play g6 just to shut that out. Knight to e2, just preparing c4. It would be a goal of white's to open up the position while we're behind in development, but as you can see, it's there's just no time to do that. We're pretty safe. We have like c4. and yeah, we're completely fine. This is our extra pawn here. You can see why it might be hard to prove that we have this extra pawn. If we can get into some sort of endgame, it might become more tangible. Here, the plan might just revolve around playing, let's say, bishop to d7. It'd be great if we could bring our bishop to b5 and trade that off. After bishop to d7, even if they stop that somehow with like an a5 move, which isn't possible in this exact position, but if they, let's say, make a preventative, some precautionary move, we have to be a little careful about taking on a2 and giving them some counterplay, but yeah, after a move like bishop to d7, we can challenge them on the c-file, and the game just proceeds like that. It's a maneuvering game where we're up a pawn, so you can have fun with that. But as I was saying, I can understand if that's not to everybody's tastes. So as a secondary option, we can, of course, play knight takes c3. The only thing I'd say is don't be greedy. Don't take twice. Just play bishop f5 and get your bishop outside of the pawn chain. After a move like castles, you can play g6, where our other bishop will come to g7. If you see a move like rook e1, you can hold off on developing this bishop just to see if they want to throw in queen e2. Just play knight d7. Any move like rook to b1. Don't hesitate to play b6. Move like bishop to d2. Guarding the pawn might be hinting at c4. C4 is not an immediate threat because we'll always have queen a6 and any sort of extra pawn push, and we can just take the bishop on d3. Now we can play bishop g7, queen e2, e6, and black's better here. If white could somehow trap our bishop, then of course that would be a problem, but there's nowhere for this bishop to go really. And you'll see that after we castle, we'll have consolidated just about completely, and then we can play this middle game where we are just in fact up a pawn. Computer doesn't even show any compensation for white in a position like this. This is, I think, evaluations like -1, which is perfectly up a pawn, or -0.8, so very minimal compensation in the fact that our coordination is a little off with our queen outside of our pawn chain, but yeah, very playable position, so that's a secondary option. That's a bit more complicated, but it's probably worth going into complication to prove your advantage with the extra pawn. So most of your opponents aren't going to make this autopilot move that will lose them a pawn. Most of your opponents are going to play bishop to d3, and then we have e5. So this is a good moment to stop and talk about what's going on, because while the best move is knight f3, we should not ignore the fact that there are lots of different liquidations possible in the center, and that you should know how to, you should be ready, know how to handle all of them. I will definitely say that any liquidation in the center is in our favor. Anytime that you see these pawn captures on e5, it pretty much means that white's already given up their complete advantage, because essentially they're trading one of their forward center pawns for this d pawn once we recapture, and that just negates any advantage that they had. So be happy to see a move like, let's say, f takes e5, d takes e5, and we'll cover the full liquidation in a second here, but here I just want to show, let's say, within the bounds of f takes e5, knight f3, we can trade again and prepare to work against this isolated pawn. Bishop d6, let's say castles, and castles with a move like rook e8 coming. Now, there is an interesting point here, and this is something that you should be very aware of in any games. When I saw this position, the computer was telling me that it's fine, and it definitely is, but you have to be aware what happens if white gets a little crazy here and tries to open you up. And so right off the bat, black is completely fine after g takes f6, but you should just know a couple moves here. Bishop h6, white is really looking to prepare some sort of queen g4 to checkmate us, so you have to be careful. I already have the arrow here, and the arrow turns to red once they play knight f5, because now it's an immediate threat, but we can just grab that. And you can see that the attack is falling short. After king h8, well, first of all, if the bishop's trade, there's no more checkmate threat. Our king can hide safely on h8, and our rook can come to the g-file. We're a little behind in the development here, but once we get our knight out, if we have to, we can bring it out to a6, but ideally we can try to get it to d7 so it can use the e5 square. yeah, once we fix that, then we'll be up in exchange, so definitely better. But yeah, do be aware that this is a possibility and that white does get some compensation. A little initiative going here, but um, you should definitely castle. That's the best way to play. You don't need to, let's say, consider going into some secondary line where you play knight d7. This is actually possible. I thought of this as an alternate suggestion, but there's just no reason to do it. The key point here is that after the move knight f5, you can actually just castle, and you have queen c5 recovering the piece, king h1, queen takes d6. It's a pretty normal position. We're playing against the isolated pawn still. It's a really open position, and we don't want to give away our bishop pair so easily. It's just not, I think, it's not worth it. It's not a good thing to do in general, and so I'm not going to recommend it to you. I think you should just invite complications with the rook takes f6, but rook takes f6 isn't such a great move. More likely than not, they'll play a move like, let's say, king to h1, and then after bishop to g4, you have a really good position. You're attacking the queen, you'll be following up with knight b to d7 anyways, then you'll play rook e8. I'll just play against the isolated pawn here. It's definitely a position that I would play any day of the week. So that was all within the bounds of f takes e5. Let's see if e takes e5. Of course, we take back with the pawn. And so a couple of options here. Actually, let's just jump right into the double liquidation. So here, I want to make an important point that we're not going to be taking back with the queen. Our queen is here to support the square, but it's not the piece that wants to be sitting here, at least not while white still has knight f3. So in fact, the key move here is knight g4. We want to have the knight come back and recapture on the square. So after a move like knight f3 and takes, now we're happy to have the queen here because there's no knight f3 tempo. And after a move like queen f3, just bishop d6, there was a threat of bishop f4 to gain the tempo. Now, even after g3, it's actually not such a big deal. We can just play knight to d7. If bishop f4, this is following a game actually between two strong players, but after bishop d2, black just brought their queen back to e7, the knight's coming into e5, and this is a good position for black. Notice this is a really nice blockade of the isolated pawn. All these pieces are kind of shut out by black's pawn structure. We can castle very safely and play bring our bishop to some square. Already bishop g4 is a threat. Bishop can come to e6, or rooks can come to the open file. This would be very, very favorable for black. I'd say very, very favorable. It's not like it's outright winning or anything, but just a really nice strategic advantage that you're going to be nursing the whole game. So I think I want to give that a lot of weight. So let's say there are a couple other options that white could choose here in a position like this. Let's say knight f3 is going to be the most logical. You can also face a move like f5, but whenever they close up the center like this, that invites us to just start our expansion on the queen side. After a move like knight f3, knight to d7, queen to e2, you can just play solidly, play a6, make your solid construction here. Your bishop will come to b7, the other bishop will come to d6. Whenever white castles kingside, we will be free to castle kingside. Do be careful that if you castle kingside too early, when white hasn't castled their king here, you might be inviting a pawn storm, but for now, we can kind of play the waiting game and see what white does with their king. If white castles queenside, then maybe we just leave our king in the center and we get our queen out of the way and start making a pawn storm of our own. Just fight their queenside with your queenside, basically, if they attack you there, and just play sensibly like that to see what white does with their king. If instead the more logical knight f3, you can just play knight to d7, bishop d6, and if we get the same thing, notice now that white has castled kingside. We can castle kingside safely now. After a move like a nice prophylactic move like king to h1, we can play our queenside expansion. And important, but I think a very nice point is that with our queen still in a5, We can go for this b4 push and trade off our bad bishop for, well, also their bad bishop. I called this our bad bishop, even though it's not the bishop that's on the same colored square as our pawn here. But this bishop is going to be pretty active, since it's quite easily able to get out of the pawn chain later in the game. And this bishop was actually hemmed in by our queenside pawns and our knight, so I am going to consider this our inferior bishop. But even though this is like a defending bishop, if we can make this trade happen after, let's say, bishop g5, we can just flick in h6, no danger of him taking, so we can make him come to a decision. b4, we would have this pawn to play against, and this would afford us a lot of nice complicated play where it's not so clear if black is in any danger at all by white's, let's say, kingside space, and we get to fight against a backwards pawn. And this is a nice kind of complicated game that we're looking for in these positions. This is already considered roughly equal by the computer, so definitely nothing to worry about. I think in general that takes care of all the possible liquidations in the center. So that means that we should now delve into mainline knight f3. So what's going on here? There are a couple different moves that I considered recommending here. Well, I considered all the logical moves and then came down to my eventual choice. Let's say the first move that I kind of ruled off was bishop g4, even though it was it is the most common move in the position in my database, at least. I think that it's kind of the wrong approach that we're looking for. It's a very harmonious move where we remove the bishop before playing knight b to d7, and we set up all our pieces quite logically. But it's just, I think, against the spirit of the position where we're looking for a nice complicated fight, and by giving out the bishop pair so quickly, it's kind of like saying that we're condemning ourselves to be slightly worse, where we've kind of given up the fight for complications just to get some sort of simplification. I can't speak. Anyways, the other logical move that I considered recommending here is knight b to d7, and I would wholeheartedly recommend this move if I didn't have a more interesting flavor to be sharing with e takes d4 exclamation point question mark. I give this the interesting move, and it is indeed interesting. It's not just interesting. Don't just take my word for it that this is a good move. This is also pointed out by the strong grandmaster Varuzhan Akobian. Since the whole Czech Pirc is kind of like a pet line of his, he's got a lot of games in the database and things of that nature, and this is the one that he's essayed before. It's a lot more challenging for white than you might think, since we're giving up the center, but there are a couple key points that are going to follow that give us a nice complicated fight. So let me just really briefly, knight b to d7 is also a very recommendable line, and you can get these positions where you have some sort of typical position where you might play for b5 and get your queenside play in such a manner. This is also very, very playable. But the recommendation here that I'm going to suggest is e takes d4. After knight takes d4, queen b6, asking white, what do you want to do with your knight? So the two moves I'm going to be covering here are the main one, knight to b3, and also what if they just go back knight to f3. And in both cases, black is pretty comfortable. I'll start with the less common, knight to f3. After knight to f3, just play bishop b7. Let's say white wants to develop their bishop. Already you can see here's where the problem is coming in for white. Even though we played all these strange moves, because they've played this early f4, what are they supposed to do with their king when they can't castle? And how are they supposed to develop their dark squared bishop? They would like to develop it after playing queen e2. And whoops, my mouse is freezing there. After queen e2, bishop to e3. But first they have to defend the pawn. So they can do this all in some order, well, as long as they don't start with moving the bishop and giving us the pawn for free. So after, let's say, rook b1, castles, queen e2, knight b to d7. So they get what they want, but in the time that they took to do that, we've also finished development and we're ready to expand on the queen side. After castles, b5. Notice that our early c6 move, this is going to be a common theme of us expanding on the queen side. After fighting in the center, solidifying the center, we expand on the queen side, and this is just a major kind of theme for this whole Czech Pirc system with the early c6. So white's best here is going to be to play b4. A move like a3 is a little passive. We can play knight to c5, and then we have all of our typical moves. We can expand further on the queen side with a5. We can play rook to e8, maybe even bishop to f8 if we want to pressure the e4 pawn some more. Our bishop can sit nicely on some square, maybe a little careful about putting it on e6 in case we invite f5. Now, also another point for the center that white has, even though we have less central space here, notice that it's very difficult for white to kind of, let's say, push us around in the center, because moves like f5 invite a reroute of our knight to e5, and if they play e5 too early, then maybe they get a weak pawn, or if the center opens up completely, then maybe we're best prepared to put our rooks on the open files. So this is going to be more of a maneuvering and outpost square kind of game. Also the same can be said for after b4, maybe a5, a3 takes. You can see that we're fighting for some outpost squares here. Bishop b6, and this is all the same things apply about this pawn structure that I said before. And we're fighting for outpost squares. I think this is a position that, while favored slightly by the computer, just because of white's space advantage, I think any sort of player who's comfortable in maneuvering situations will be happy to play this position. I would be happy to play this position. There's just a lot of different plans you can adopt. It's definitely more of a long-term strategy game than that I think suits black because of the fact that we're fighting for outpost squares that white doesn't have the same luxury of fighting for. All right, so just backing up here. All right, where were we? Yes, after queen b6, knight to b3. So this is the main move, and makes a lot of sense because it's also covering the b2 pawn so that you can quickly come after our queen with, let's say, queen e2 and bishop to e3. However, we can throw in a5 and prepare to harass the knight a little on the b3 square. So there are two main approaches that white can take here. One is just shutting us down completely with a4. However, I think that these kinds of middle games are going to be very playable for black. After knight a6, notice how we now have this nice outpost square. This is the same sort of theme that we just saw from the other position where we have an outpost square that white doesn't have because we played more conservatively. Even though they have a bit more space, we're playing around the space that they've left behind. And also we have bishop g4 incoming. So let's say after any sort of like queen f3 or queen e2 to prepare bishop e3, we can throw in bishop to g4. And if they play queen e3, just trade knight b4. And for the moment, we do have to, in general, be careful about whether or not they can trap our bishop. But for the moment, any f5, let me just show that, can just be met by d5, and no problem there. So if we back up a little more, let's say that they play like something like queen to g3. We still play here. Already h3 would be a mistake after bishop e6. Notice how white's running into some problems with the coordination of the defense here. So would not be afraid of that. Queen e2, same can be said for queen e2. Notice how we've achieved the exact same position. So jumping back a little, that pretty much is the ideas behind a4. After that, after the a4, we'll have bishop e7 and castles in a very nice position where we can use the half-open file against the e-pawn. So let's say that white tries to punish us with queen e2, quickly preparing bishop to e3, and so of course we double down with a4 and bishop to e3. Now, it should be noted that in this position, there is a more challenging move, which is knight to d2, and we'll get into this into a second, but it's going to be less commonly played than bishop to e3, queen b4, and now we've reached this really interesting position, and I actually want to start by showing you a little trap that white can fall into if they're not careful. A3 might actually, of course, they're not missing the fact that after we take, the rook will be traded because they'll be giving up a knight and a rook for a queen, but they might overlook the fact that after we do this trade, this is game over. This is something that can happen very easily, especially in a blitz game, where you just forget about the fact that the bishop can come to g4. This is a common theme in these positions, and yeah, this would be game over. Any sort of like, if the queen moves, you, of course, you run into direct trouble with if they get the knight and the rook. That's way too much material. So there are better moves here. Actually, one really interesting move here is castling is actually very playable, just due to the fact that after taking, which is the best move, you can't take on a1. You have to play rook to a6. After rook takes a1, we have this problem. It's actually quite funny, and in fact, we probably deserve it after all that play, speculative play. But our queen would get trapped here. Even if we played d5 after something like this, we run into immediate problems. So this would be losing for us. However, worry not. We don't have to take on a1. We can play rook to a6, and we do get 2 pieces for the rook, which is quite nice. And something like this isn't a problem. This is completely playable for us. We just have to be careful not to get any attack on f7, and we can leave our knight here to defend a6 for the moment. We can castle, and once we've consolidated, we can play this middle game with the 2 pieces for the rook. And I think it's definitely more than equal chances. Another way of playing instead of castles is, of course, a move like knight to d4. But here, and the same can be said for knight to d2, here we can play a3, which is a knight to b3. Yeah, notice how the pawn has to defend this knight, so there's no liquidation here. Of course, you can also transpose into what I'm about to show if they started with rook to b1, taking rook to b1, bishop b7, something like castles, bishop d2. All right, we have to be a little careful about our queen. Say rook to e8, and just coming back with the queen to c7. This is a completely equal position. This space advantage isn't really telling. We have we've activated our rook basically for free against a weak pawn. We just need to get our pieces out, get our knight to some square, and that would absolve us of any sort of problems here. Our pawn structure is not deficient in any way, so I think this is a very playable middle game for black if they were to play that way, which is probably the most common way that you'll get. I don't think many people would be looking to go into the complications after castling, and a3 is just, of course, a mistake. So already this is the meat of the position. We've looked at most of the common lines. Now, knight to d2 is is the most challenging move. Of course, after bishop g4, if a move like queen f2, king takes f2. Here's a position where we do have to be careful about f5. Just bring your bishop back. Knight f3, e5. For that in take. Doesn't matter so much that we have this isolated pawn because we're going to have really active pieces to work around it. Of course, bishop comes to g4, knight to c6. We have castles. If isolated pawns aren't your thing, well, you have a secondary option of sacrificing pawns with just castling. And this is also we've got really decent compensation here. Notice that white's king is a little stranded here. We have active pieces. Our bishop will come to g5 or something. Our rooks will come to the open file. Two I think very, very playable options for black. Now, challenging line, I keep hinting that this is a challenging line. The challenging line is after this really strong move, knight to c4. This is where the problems start to arise. After bishop takes e2, knight takes b6, bishop takes d3. Actually, the best move for white here is to play c takes d3. If we takes the rook, this isn't problematic at all. Taking b2, we're going to win e4 as well. Doesn't matter that they win a5 because we get to solidify in the center. Let's say moves like this. We don't want to lose time, so we give it to the bishop. Keep this position in your mind. This is considered completely equal by the computer, and I agree. Even though we've gone down in exchange, notice how we have some very strong connected pawns here that will be a great asset in the endgame. I think this is the kind of let's say dynamically equal position that favors black, because as long as you're solid, white won't be beating you, and you're the one who has all the trumps in the endgame if white presses too hard or something, or goes astray, where you have the chance to make a queen. So this is the kind of equal I would like to play. And if we back up a bit here, yeah. So the main challenge comes though from when they take back, because what's going to happen here essentially is that we are going to lose this pawn on a5, and we get compensation for it, but this is going to be, I think, you're really fighting for the compensation. I don't want this line to deter you from playing this variation. I just want you to be aware of it. For instance, in my database, this line has never occurred ever. This is just something I found while I was fiddling around with the computer, and I analyzed this quite deeply, and the results of my analysis were that white does have a slight edge, but that's the kind of risk that we take when we play an opening like the Czech Pirc. We're hoping for complications, but if white is, let's say, a 2600 Grandmaster, don't expect to have an easy time. I think the best move here is d5, just to show an example line, and you can take back on d5 as well, but I think you get the most chances from doing this on pawn sacrifice. You're going to get a pawn back. It's not really in white's favor to take a second pawn after something like this. Yeah, because notice how already we have a little bit of a threat here. After, let's say that they played some random move, we can take rook takes b6 and get two pieces for, notice that we can check here. We can't do it right away, just for the reason that until we're castled, if we were to play, like, let's say, rook takes b6 here, the problem that we run into, oh, no, this isn't right. No, in that case we would do that. I'm embarrassing myself, but there is a very good reason why we can't do that right away, and that we should castle first. Oh, yes, of course, I have the move order wrong. You start with rook check, and after we move our king somewhere, they're able to play bishop to e3 when we play bishop to c5. Move orders are important. You heard it here first. Yeah, so just to finish up the line here, bishop d6, knight c4, bring our bishop to an active square. We can get a position like this where this is like a final position. You just have to believe in the compensation here and that it does exist, and it truly does. Notice how we have good play against these pawns. White will have a hard time developing, and that we have a bit of extra space and active pieces. Just do be aware that you can go down a pawn and that you'll have to be fighting. But this pretty much wraps up the whole entirety of the main line of the Austrian, and don't let this deter you. I think chances of you even seeing this are next to none, and I think even if you follow these kinds of lines as a general analysis and guidelines here, you'll have a very playable position. So I hope you learned something. Do make sure to check out the secondary video that will cover the other two lines that I mentioned with pawn coming to e5 and bishop coming to d2. They will be equally important towards your understanding of the Austrian main lines, so that you can be playing this at the highest level and challenging your opponents with the Czech Pirc. So thank you for watching, and check out the other videos.